Hello, it's Steve Smith here again, and this is presentation number 15. Apologies if 15, 16, 17 are slightly out of sequence, but I'm sure you can find the topics that you're looking for anyway. Now, this is a very practical pedagogy-based session, and it's entitled Exploiting a Picture for Advanced Storytelling. So here I'm talking about a lesson idea for you that could work with advanced groups or potentially intermediate groups, and preferably groups that are smaller in size. You'll see why as we go through. So what are we talking about here? This sort of lesson very much is in the kind of vein of communicative language teaching, where we take a picture which doesn't require a great deal of description, because that's not the point here. The idea is that the picture is a starting point for some creative storytelling. So we're going to have a class here, a smallish group, let's say, who are going to help you. In fact, they're going to lead the process, really, in talking about the story behind the picture, because that's what we're looking at here, the story behind the picture. Now, before I talk about some principles and how this might work in practice, the sort of pictures that I think work well here are ones that aren't necessarily your classic language teaching pictures with lots of detail in and lots of vocabulary, but ones, as I say, which might feature characters which could tell a story. So there's one example, and these are all from pixabay.com. Here's a second example. And a third one. And a fourth. And a fifth. Now, you could go and find your own pictures, whatever tickles your fancy or whatever you think could be the basis of some interesting storytelling in class. Now, what are the principles of this sort of activity? Well, I think it's one of those where as a teacher you need to let go a little bit. So the class are going to take control of the story, and you're going to act as a sort of mediator, guide on the side, as it were, suggesting ideas perhaps if the students dry up or can't come up with anything that they're satisfied with. You might want to occasionally write up language on the board, or if students get stuck for some particular vocabulary, you could help them with that, write it up on the board for them. I'd go along with the principle of accepting any suggestions that the students have. So accept everything, and then allow some democracy in the group. So let the group decide what they think the most interesting route is for the story. And some groups will be really creative here and go off in all sorts of wacky directions, and end up with kind of soap opera style stories behind the characters, or kind of really surreal stuff. But that's absolutely fine. Whatever turns them on, keeps them talking, would be great. So you can help them take the story forwards. So, for example, if they've come up with 3 or 4 different options, you might suggest why one might be better, potentially. Or if they find they're going down a blind alley, you could perhaps bring them back and take them down a different route. I think one thing you can definitely do here is encourage looking back, to get them to use past tenses, and looking forward. But that's not to take too much control, but I think you can nudge them in that sort of direction. And you could do this either pretty much as a teacher-led task from the front with your group of students, which is probably what I would go for, or you could do it as a pair or group task with the right kind of group. But I think if you're going to do it in pairs or groups, they'd need to be pretty competent, and you'd need to be able to trust their ability to be creative and come up with stories. I don't think this is a case for correcting very much at all. This is what would be termed in this communicative sort of paradigm as a fluency activity rather than an accuracy activity. It's about communication. But, you know, why not do some recasting? You know what I mean by recasting, don't you? Which is if they say something which is faulty, just to say it again in the correct way, but rather gently. So you're not really explicitly correcting, but you're just making sure that the group hears correct versions. But sometimes you can just ignore errors, because really the focus here is on meaning and communication. You might choose as well to have some sort of written outcome at the end of it. I'm not sure I would spell that out at the beginning of the task, because you don't want this to feel too much like a piece of work, you know, where there is an outcome at the end. You want this to be as spontaneous as possible, I would suggest. Now, once you've got your picture in front of you, you can just set the ball rolling, you know, start off with some basic descriptive stuff, you know, who are these people, describe the scene, get the students to, you know, give them names and ages, you know, where are they from, where do they live, and accept all the ideas that students come up with. You know, you might find there's an advantage for them being of the same nationality as the language, the target language country that you're teaching, but it's not really a big deal. Let them come up with ideas about their, you know, personality, their interests, you know, family, jobs. Keep prompting them, you know, ask them things like, you know, what's their star sign, you know, what's their favorite color, you know, tell me something embarrassing about their past, you name it, you know, just let their imaginations wander. If you've got characters who appear to be communicating, which is not a bad starting point for these pictures, then, you know, what are they talking about? Why are they talking about it? Why are they there? What have they just done recently? What have they done in the more distant past that's led to this situation? What's going to happen next? So, you know, you can push the conversation into all sorts of directions and see what the class come up with. All the while, of course, you're using lots and lots of target language input here. So this is a great task for listening and interacting with the listening input, you know, which is kind of basics of second language acquisition, isn't it? Input plus interaction equals acquisition. You know, if you break it down to its very, very simplest, that's kind of how we acquire language, isn't it? You could, I suppose, try and work in language that you've been using recently in class. That would be quite a smart thing to do, wouldn't it? To recycle language that the class has been doing recently or in the past. And so, you know, you could then follow this up. I'm not saying, you know, this is something you'd necessarily want to do, but if you think it suits that particular class, you could then read out an account of the story that the students created. I mean, you've been listening all along, you'll have it clearly in your mind, so this is something you could, you know, improvise. Read out the account, at which point this is a good chance for students to recap, so they could take notes and copious notes in the target language with the potential for a write-up. They could just feedback orally, but as you're doing the note-taking, you can write some things up on the board, and this might be a good time to check for a few accuracy issues, just to check that there's been no misunderstandings about particular areas of vocabulary or structures. And then they could write up that account that they've done in class. The advantage of that is that they'd be recycling the same language. If you wanted to take a more risky strategy, they could make up their own story based on the same picture, or with some groups, they could find their own picture and write a story, or simply give them a free choice amongst those different options. So, all in all, what we've got here is it could be a one-off lesson that you do with a smaller group, which can be quite fun. I can tell it's the sort of activity that students enjoy, and it brings out their creative streak, and which allows you to use lots of comprehensible input and lots of target language. So one to be recommended there. Now, that sort of activity was one, I picked up that one years ago when I was learning about communicative language teaching as a very young teacher, and I think I was teaching on EFL courses, and one of the writers who I found quite influential at the time was Penny who you might have heard of, who's a veteran writer and teacher in the field of English as a second language or English as a foreign language. And she wrote a book back in I think it was the late 70s, called Discussions That Work, which had lots of examples of this sort of task-based discussion, or task-oriented discussion. And fairly recently there was an updated version of the same book which came out, which I'd recommend to you, and it's called Discussions and More, Oral Fluency Practice in the Classroom. And I mentioned for Gianfranco's book, or the book that I wrote with Gianfranco, called The Language Teacher Toolkit, which you may be familiar with, where you'll find lots and lots of lovely lesson ideas. So that's all for this session. Thank you very much for listening, and in the next session I will be talking about memory.